put a lift in my outfeed table so that my planer and my table saw could share the same cart. I can rip lumber on one side, then slide the table over, raise the planer, raise it, and then plane the board, obviously. And it all fits in this very compact cart that I keep against the wall in my very small shop. Most benchtop planers are somewhere between 75 and 90 pounds. My back feels like it's somewhere between 75 and 90 years old. So I don't ever want to have to lift this thing again. I see a lot of flip-top carts on YouTube with a planer on one side and then something like a benchtop sander on the other. And I'm always a little confused because this weighs about half as much as this. And I know that there's a fulcrum involved, but when you're rotating two objects of different weights, don't you still have to lift something? The machine that does all the lifting is a scissor jack, specifically a stabilizer jack. These are used mostly for trailers and RVs. And I got this one at Harbor Freight for about 35 bucks a couple years ago. So now, I don't know, 40, 45 bucks. The scissor jack that's in the trunk of your car is not big enough for this. And I'm not talking about the amount of weight it can handle. I'm talking about the lifting range from totally collapsed to fully extended. There are several other types of jacks and they all won't work, like bottle jacks, too small. These cool pneumatic airbags, they're also just too small, not enough range. And even a conventional trolley jack, you can see as it lifts, it might have the overall lifting range, but it just moves too far off of center to make it work for this. What we're ultimately trying to solve for is the distance from the top of the table to the overall top of the planer, which in my case is about 16 inches rounded up. We're not worried about the base of the planer. That's going to stay below the table. It will never have to be factored in. However, we are interested in the height of the outfeed table that's going to slide from side to side. In my case, that's about 1 inch. For a grand total of 17 inches of lifting range, that's what our jack needs to be able to accommodate. Of course, every planer is going to be a little bit different, and yes, I am removing the handle at the top. You can see our stabilizer jack has a range of about 18 7/8, which gives us a little margin for error and fine tuning, which I will need. The only other type of off-the-shelf solution I could come up with is a lift table, and there are a lot of these out there. They can be kind of expensive, and this is a YouTube channel for the people, so I try to make my solutions a bit more accessible. However, this could be a really great option for a small shop if you're willing to invest in it. The stabilizer jack has a pair of brackets at the top that are going to come in really useful in a minute. And you can see the range from fully collapsed to fully extended is pretty much the best you can find off the shelf. The stabilizer jack comes with these hand cranks, which are pretty simple and effective, especially if you want an arm workout, but it's a lot easier if you just get a 3/4 inch socket, put it on a drill, and then let technology do the work for you. Now I have some ideas about how to automate this with some other devices that would be switched so you don't have to get down here. That's not going to happen in this video. I don't know when that's going to happen, but stay tuned maybe. I started off with an old drafting table that I'm pretty sure was built in 1977, like for real. I found a sticker. You can see here there's hinges on this thing, and there's this rod that holds the table up, and then there was this giant panel where there was a light box underneath and a pane of glass, which I promptly shattered. And as a result, this is not a scratch build, so I'm not going to have plans for it per se. I also had to modify this thing quite a bit. Here I'm taking the front panel off and milling down a 2x4 so that I can get just a larger board to start screwing stuff into. There are a lot of workbench build videos out there, and that's essentially what this is a workbench with wheels on it. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this part of the build, but I will mention that the table was naturally 46 inches, and that was too short. I definitely could have used a little more space, 48 inches, even 60 inches, to clear all the hoses once I put the vacuum on and all the dust collection, which you'll see in a minute. The only other thing I will mention here is I put some extra stretchers on just to reinforce kind of the base of this thing, which is going to carry all the weight from the planer. Most of the weight will sit in the center of the table because that's where the planer will be situated, but these extra stretchers will help distribute it a little bit more toward the side. For the base that the planer is going to sit on, I made a little platform by squaring off one edge of some 2x3s, which if you've never done that before, it's very satisfying. And then I arranged them on a piece of plywood with roughly 4-inch gaps, and that's important, which you'll see here in a second. Most planers are designed to be bolted down. This one has two different bolt holes, a 1/4 inch and a 3/8 inch, so I went with the smaller of the two. I marked it on the platform, then I moved the planer and drilled the rest of the holes, and then I used 1/4 inch threaded inserts, and I find that those go in easiest with a little bit of dish soap and water. I made sure that everything lined up okay, but before I bolted it in place permanently, I flipped it over and I marked off the spot where the stabilizer jack would be attached to the underside of the platform. And here I'm putting another set of threaded inserts on the underside of the platform because I'm going to need the ability to unbolt this thing multiple times before it's all said and done. For the table saw, I built a little stand using 2x3s with dowel and pocket hole joinery, and this was on an open-ended side of the cart. And then when I topped it with plywood, I cut some notches in it so the saw could hang out the side a little bit, just to make up for some of that lost space. As I mentioned, this cart was not quite long enough. This bracket down the middle was mostly useless. I didn't end up bolting anything to it, but it did help support the outfeed table. Speaking of the outfeed table, this one is made out of laminated MDF, which is fairly easy to get your hands on, except mine came from the deck of a broken treadmill because I'm thrifty like a raccoon. And then I took some 1-inch poplar and I just glued and brad nailed it to the sides. Then I added these pieces to the bottom so it would be flush with the edges and I could use the outfeed table for clamping, which sounds like a disease. Finally, I beveled the top edges with a trim router, and then I flush cut the top so that it would be flush. And then on the underside, I lock it in place with deadbolts on either side. So now that I've got the outfeed table basically complete, I'm going to put it on here in planer position, which is covering the table saw. And then I'm going to mock up the final height of my lift mechanism just with some scrap wood on the bottom. And then I've got the platform installed here on the jack. And then I'm going to use this cardboard box to mock up the planer itself. And here I've got a line drawn for where the outfeed is going to come out of the planer. And I've overcompensated a little bit. It's a little bit high. Of course, I can bring that back down with the jack. One thing to point out here is this giant screw sticking out of the jack. I'm going to have to offset this whole thing before I bolt it in place so I don't smash my shin on it down the road. Under the jack is where I was talking about using those additional stretchers both on the sides and in the center so that the weight can be distributed. And here I'm using 1x kind of as spacers just to adjust the resting height of the jack by 1 inch at a time. Alright, this is a problem I knew I'd have to solve for before I started this project, and that is the wobble. I don't want this thing wiggling or wobbling when it's on its way up and down, or when it's in final position planing boards. So my solution was closet door slides and tracks. These slides only need to prevent the planer from wobbling forward and backward, and they'll do a surprisingly good job while allowing it to move up and down freely. I cut the tracks to roughly 2-foot sections and then installed them against the piece of lumber that I bolted to the frame. I drilled a 3/8 hole into the platform of the planer, installed the slide, and then I adjusted the stop on the track to roughly where I thought it would go before I set the jack and the platform back in place, and then I just popped that slide right into the track, tightened down that stop, and then let the jack do its thing. Uh-oh. The platform was getting hung up on the frame, so I had to adjust the base of the jack, shave this corner off for good measure, and then I was back in business. I also installed these stops so that when the lift is in the fully collapsed position, it's nice and sturdy when I'm moving it around the shop. Here you can see it lowering all the way until it hits the stops. And then I put the lift all the way up into planer position, and I opened the outfeed from the planer so I could make sure it was in perfect alignment with my new outfeed table. And then I clamped it against the frame of the bench so I could install threaded inserts and really lock it into place, eliminating any wiggle when I'm using the planer. And I mounted these kind of low so I could put a second set above them in case I wanted to outfeed directly onto my table saw so I could use both machines at the same time, in which case the platform would be a bit lower. Bottom line is now it's really stable. For dust collection, I got this little Ridgid shop vac and I added a dust bag inside the vacuum. Even though I'm going to be using a dust separator, I thought this bag would just provide a little bit of insurance to try to extend the life of this vacuum since I'm going to be collecting a lot of dust with it. And then I took the wheels off because I actually don't want it rolling around underneath the table saw platform, which is where I'm going to be installing this thing, and I needed to reduce the height as much as possible. I like to put diffusers on the outflow of my vacuums whenever I can. It just helps keep the dust from flying around the shop. Despite my modifications to the vacuum, it still would not fit underneath the table saw, so I had to cut into the platform frame just a little bit. This didn't really damage the integrity too much because I put plywood on top, and then I crammed the vacuum underneath and it just barely fit. So I've got the dust separator tucked in right here. It's the dust stopper model on top of a 5-gallon bucket, and I just barely squeaked it in. I had to notch some of the platforms out to get it to fit in there. Here's everything assembled from an overhead view. The vacuum is under here. The dust separator is right here with a line going to the vacuum here. And then I have vacuum lines going to the table saw and the planer, both interrupted by blast gates. Overall, you can see things are a little bit cramped. The planer gets hung up on the dust separator. I had to notch out the bracket where it was hanging from to get it to fit. Ideally, this whole thing would be about 50 inches from side to side, not including overhangs. Also, notice how the planer is mounted tight to the far side of the frame here. I had to move it there after the fact to get clearance for the dust chute on the planer against all my vacuum lines and my dust separator. And then I later went back and added a third blast gate running to the side where I have an auxiliary vacuum port. So I've got the vacuum underneath the table saw, and then I've got everything connected to this automatic vacuum switch, which automatically turns the vacuum on whenever either the table saw or the planer are switched on. This is what it's called. I got it on Amazon. I'll link it in the description. And then another thing to point out is on my table saw here, I offset this one so that if I need to make miter cuts on the table saw, it has room to flex. I did eventually cut miter slots into the surface of the outfeed table, but sadly it was not YouTube worthy, so you will not be seeing that here. In the end, I had a table that worked in multiple configurations like this, and this, and this, and even this. So this table is not the ultimate anything, it's not perfect, it's just a really good configuration for my setup. I have a very small shop. I know there's a lot of other people out there who have very small shops, and I'm hoping that this will be useful in some way for other people as well. I don't have anything against flip-top tables. I'm going to be building one of those also for my benchtop sander and my joiner that's currently sitting over there on the floor. I hope that there's something that you can take from this and incorporate into your shop. One thing I couldn't solve was how to get to clear this knob because the stabilizer jack doesn't go quite high enough for those extra 3 inches. That's about it.